Okay, so let's take a look at Luke 13 and 14, which we're reading this week. The shadows are getting longer the closer that Jesus and the guys get to Jerusalem. When asked about horrifying injustices perpetrated by the Romans and by falling masonry, Jesus, at the beginning of chapter 13, reiterates his warning of things getting worse. They're going to get much worse. And Jesus wants his hearers to prepare for that. He says, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Jesus is warning that there is a cataclysm coming. And it turned up 30 years later when Nero began what were called the Jewish Wars. The years 66 to 71 AD. It ended at Masada, which is probably the most famous part of that. You know, that mountaintop fortress Masada out in the Judean wilderness, where the last Jewish survivors took their own lives. In all, in the Jewish war, some 2 million Jews were murdered, and the Jerusalem temple was forever destroyed. It was a true Holocaust. It killed a higher percentage of Jews in the world back in the first century than the Nazis did in the 20th century. That's what looms on Jesus' horizon. Now, Jesus had been coming to Jerusalem back and forth for the feast for 3 years. And every time, the reception was the same. The religious authorities nitpicked the finer points of the law as a pretext to protect their own power, to preserve the status quo. They would rather reject the Messiah than to give up a smidgen of their control. And so the parable of the fig tree at the beginning of chapter 13 in Luke's gospel here shows Jesus granting them one more year to repent, to bear fruit. And if not, then cut it down. Jesus then goes on to tell the parable of the narrow door and the parable of the banquet, in which Jesus shows how the invited guests, the people of Israel, will see Gentiles coming from the four corners of the earth to the feast, while they themselves opt out, which illustrates Jesus' point that the first, the Israelites, shall be last. And then Jesus laments over Jerusalem, how I longed to gather you up, but you would not, and now your house is left to you desolate. Oh, such a heartrending note. And on that note, let's turn back to the book of Ruth, back to Boaz and his role as kinsman redeemer. These three characters in the book of Ruth are so admirable. Naomi exhibiting such loving care that Ruth felt drawn to stay with her even after her husband had died, to follow her God, Yahweh, and to adopt Israel as her own people. It's just a beautiful picture of Israeli evangelism, as I like to call it. The witnessing of God's people, Israel, were to do to the Gentiles around them. But Boaz's role as kinsman redeemer is truly pivotal to the whole plot. What is the kinsman redeemer? Family ties were so strong in Israel from one generation to the next that family members had an obligation to redeem their kin. Of course, we think of the word redeeming as a theological term, as a religious term, but in the Bible, it's a family term. It means defending your family in cases of injustice, providing for them if they became destitute. The laws of the kinsman redeemer ensured that each generation of Israelites would continue as heirs of the promised land. It wasn't just for the whole nation, but for each family that made it up. So if your brother or cousin became destitute and had to sell themselves or their land, the kinsman redeemer would step in later to buy it back, to give it back. If your brother or your cousin died without a child, the kinsman redeemer would see to it that his widow bore a child so that his name would not die out in the next generation. And this is what Boaz is asked to do, to provide an heir for Ruth's husband who had died childless. So to redeem means to restore one's birthright. And thus Yahweh himself redeemed Israel from slavery in Egypt. Thus Jesus redeemed all of humanity from the bondage of evil, so that, as he said, the meek shall inherit the earth, your birthright restored. But Jesus warns here in Luke 14, we saw it in our gospel reading this week, that the generation in Jerusalem that rejected the Messiah would not be redeemed. He said, your house is left to you desolate. Boom. Ouch. So our reading of Ruth is very well timed, both to the gospel readings as well as to our season here. Okay, so we have now entered the season of Pentecost this week, and we resume our Old Testament cycle of readings in the Sunday lectionary. You remember that last year we started in the book of Genesis. We preached through Genesis, through Exodus, Joshua, and the book of Judges. Well, this year we pick up now where we left off back then, stepping into Samuel and Kings, the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, covering the lives of the prophet Samuel and Kings David and Solomon, right up to the civil war that divided the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea. The book of Ruth perfectly bridges these two cycles, all right? Because as we see early in the book of Ruth, it starts at the end of the period of Judges, the time of famine and chaos. As you finish Ruth on Friday, or is it Saturday, that how Ruth closes with the all-important genealogy, which leads to King David, just 2 short generations away. So this is a very exciting time of anticipation, and we'll rejoin that story on Sunday, this coming Sunday, and we'll work our way through it in the fall. So stay tuned.